This is the 5-minute guide to the Nagato class, battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
The Nagato class were a pair of dreadnought battleships built for the Imperial Japanese Navy in the 1910s, and would be the most powerful ships in the Japanese fleet until the arrival of the Yamato class much later on. Ever since the war with Russia in 1905, the Japanese had believed that they needed a so-called 8-8 fleet in order to properly defend Japan. At the time that this policy was adopted in 1907, this was to be 8 battleships and 8 armoured cruisers, although with the advent of HMS Dreadnought and then later HMS Invincible, this was upgraded to 8 dreadnoughts and 8 battle cruisers. By 1915 they were about halfway to this goal, with the 2 Fuso class and the 2 similar Issei class comprising a 4 battleship squadron, and the Congos comprising 4 battle cruisers. The Navy wanted to order 4 more dreadnoughts, so at least half of the plan would be complete, but the Japanese government rejected this, only authorizing a single dreadnought, the Nagato. This was to be accompanied by a pair of battle cruisers. However, in 1916, the American President Woodrow Wilson announced that the American Navy was going to build 10 battleships and 6 battle cruisers, which somewhat understandably got the Japanese government to loosen the purse strings, and 3 more dreadnoughts were authorized. One of these would be the Nagato sister ship, Mutsu, and the next 2 were supposed to be to a new design. The Nagato class marked an extreme departure for the Japanese in terms of naval construction, adopting the all-or-nothing armour scheme that the Americans had pioneered as opposed to the earlier, more distributed armour scheme. This allowed the belt armour to be significantly thicker than in previous designs. It also mounted a much heavier armament, whereas the Congos, Isseis, and Fusos had used 14-inch guns. The Nagatos would adopt a Queen Elizabeth-style 2 superfiring twin turrets forward and 2 twin superfiring turrets aft layout for its guns, although these guns would be 16-inch weapons. Technically, due to the Japanese use of standard units as opposed to Imperial, they were 16.1-inch weapons. 20 Casimir-mounted 5.5-inch guns completed a secondary battery, and initially 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns provided an anti-aircraft battery. The ships were also fitted with an unusually heavy torpedo battery of 8 torpedo tubes, 4 to a side, with 2 submerged and 2 above-water tubes. Whilst their belt armour was actually quite thin for a ship of this period at 12 inches thick, they were able to exceed 26 knots on their trial runs, which actually made them about as fast as early battle cruisers, although obviously by this point battle cruisers had well exceeded that speed. As launched, the ships had a rather unusual heptapodal mainmast, which, as the name suggests, had 7 separate columns, including a central column that had an electric elevator, so the lookout didn't have to climb all the way up. Mutsu narrowly avoided being scrapped in the Washington Naval Treaty in exchange for the Americans getting to keep most of the Colorado class and the British getting to build the Nelson class. The ships would then go on to bring supplies to the survivors of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, before spending significant amounts of time in the reserves as they went through a series of modernizations throughout the 1920s. The 1930s, however, saw an extensive modernization that took several years and was effectively almost a rebuild of the ship. The main battery turrets were replaced with those designed for the Tosa class, with the main guns allowed a much increased elevation as a result. Additionally, large bulges were installed either side of the ship, which increased displacement significantly but also provided increased torpedo protection and buoyancy. The torpedo tubes were removed, and some of the secondary battery guns were also removed. In exchange, a variety of heavy machine guns and the 25mm AA guns that would prove to be so ineffective were installed to enhance the ship's anti-aircraft potential. Finally, the boilers were replaced, the stern was cut off, lengthened, and then put back on again, and of course this was with the period when they received the traditional Japanese pagoda mast that would become so prevalent in the warships of Japan in the 1930s and World War II. Despite being the second most powerful units of the Japanese fleet after the Yamato-class battleships, the 2 ships actually saw relatively little service. Mutsu, for example, would only fire its first shots in anger in the middle of 1942. This would prove to be her only action, as in June 1943, whilst in harbour, Mutsu's rear superfiring turret would suffer a magazine explosion, tearing the ship in half. Somewhat unbelievably, the loss of the ship in such a public and catastrophic manner was actually covered up, and as a result, the exact cause of the explosion remains a mystery to this day, although from the accounts that can be pieced together, speaking of smoke coming from the turret shortly before the explosion, it's possible some sort of fire had broken out. Nagato likewise was only superficially involved in World War II. Despite being the flagship for the attack on Pearl Harbor, her next real major action was at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where even then she was only lightly engaged. However, her next major action would be taking part in the Battle of Samar. As part of the center force, she would be hit by a total of 4 bombs, although the damage would not be too severe. This would be her first and only time she fired her main guns at enemy shipping, as when she got back to Japan there wasn't enough fuel or material to bring her back into service, and so instead she was turned into a floating anti-aircraft battery. In this state, suffering further damage from American fighter bomber attacks, she was captured at the end of World War II. In 1946, with a lot of the damage still unrepaired, she was hauled off to take part in Operation Crossroads. During the airburst explosion of Test Able, she was quite far from ground zero and took minimal damage. For Test Baker, the underwater test, she was positioned a lot closer, but rode out the tsunami with little apparent damage, and had only a slight list afterwards. She was, however, heavily radioactive, and therefore could not be boarded, and capsized 5 days later. As with the Prince Eugen, her wreck can still be visited in the atoll.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.